This video covers Chapter 1 in your textbook, The Purpose of Research, and it also offers additional explanation of material that is in the lecture notes that was not covered in the textbook. And so we begin with a thought exercise that I generally do when I'm teaching in person. I prompt students to close their eyes and to imagine that they are riding or driving in a car in their hometown, and they see a person running full sprint down the street. It's the middle of the day. And then I ask them to interpret or make sense of this occurrence. And I usually ask them to write this down. Emphasizing that what makes us humans truly amazing, the brain truly amazing, is that we don't just passively take in sensory data. As we are taking in sensory data through, observation, through what we hear, through what we smell, we are attempting to make sense of it, right? We are attempting to explain it, to offer an interpretation. So when you see someone in the middle of the day running full speed down the street, and you notice it, you observe it, you usually don't just passively notice and observe it. You offer some type of explanation to yourself for the phenomena in which you're seeing. So that explanation that you offer yourself, it can be different things. Normally when I take these papers up, students write down all types of things. They might reference, like they might look for additional details because I purposely keep the prompt very vague. They might say, well, if the person's wearing, workout clothes, I might assume that they are just exercising. Or they say, if the person is, dressed in clothes like they have somewhere to be, like their work clothes or work uniform, I might assume that they are, chasing the bus. Or, I once had a student say, if the person was, wearing just their underwear or was nude, I might assume that they're having a mental break. And so that is one way in which that we try to understand what's going on around us, right? We gather additional details in order to try to make sense of what we're seeing. But then we also, who we are shapes what we see. That's a saying that you maybe have heard before: who you are shapes what you see. And that's because of a sociological concept called social location. And social location isn't referring to geographically, where you're at this moment, but your placement within the social map. So your race, your ethnicity, your nationality, your gender, your sexual orientation, your socioeconomic status, your religious affiliation, all of those, your political affiliation, all of those are established social identities within our society, and they locate you on the social map, but maybe more importantly, they shape who you are. They give you specific values. They possibly give you certain biases and blind spots. And when you are observing and you're taking in that sensory information, who you are is shaping that interpretation and explanation that you might be offering, right? So, if you yourself, come from an urban area with a lot of crime, you might be more apt to imagine that you're witnessing some type of criminal, act taking place. If you are, a woman, and that there is a much greater chance that you are the victim of violence more so than an aggressor of violence, then you might be more likely to imagine that the person you're seeing, especially if that person is another woman, is running away from someone versus aggressively chasing someone, right? And so this idea that we have these social locations, so that when we're taking in, we're observing phenomena, we're offering explanations. This relates to sociology because Auguste Comte, who is the person who coined the term sociology, so he's one of our founding fathers of sociology. He emphasized that for sociologists, we needed to move beyond just armchair philosophizing, right? Which is what we do when we observe things and then offer explanations for them. He was like, we need to move beyond that. And he emphasized positivism, the idea that the capital T truth is knowable through scientific study, through the process of gathering data and then analyzing it and understanding it. And he thought this was true in the social sciences, not just necessarily in the physical sciences. And that is what sociology is, right? It reflects both of those things, the kind of positivism as well as the armchair philosophizing. Because sociology is the scientific study of society and human behavior, and kind of the two primary tenets that underlie sociology is that we use the scientific method, right? We are a scientific discipline, right? We are trying to understand the world through this process of systematically gathering, collecting data, analyzing it, and interpreting it. But we use the sociological perspective when it comes to, you know, our theorizing and, you know, shaping the topics that we are interested in and how we frame the questions. Now, if you don't remember the sociological perspective from either your introductory sociology class or maybe your classical theory class, then I encourage you to look at that video that I'm providing, which is the Crash Course Sociology, you know, what is sociology course. I think it will do a good job of reminding you that the sociological perspective, which emphasizes that bi-directional relationship that exists between the individual and larger society, so that we understand the ways in which our personal histories intersect with larger, you know, our personal biographies intersect with larger kind of social history, societal history, and context. And the two influence one another, right? We understand individuals in terms of both agency, individual agency, as well as larger social structure. We won't be focusing on that part, that underlying tenet of sociology. In this class, we are much more interested in that scientific study, scientific method part, because it's intro to research methods. So in light of that, let's take a step back and once again go back to that thought exercise. Your textbook begins with noting that humans are great knowledge accumulators. And so this is the point that I just made, right? We don't just passively absorb sensory information. We take that information and we turn it into knowledge by creating interpretations, explanations for the phenomena, for the sensory information that we are taking in. That's what we were doing. That's what I was encouraging you to imagine doing with that initial thought exercise. And so we make observations, and then especially as we notice patterns in our observations, reoccurring patterns, things that happen, you know, over and over in multiple contexts, we start to form these ideas about, okay, well, this is what's true or accurate about this social behavior, about this social phenomena. And we feel like these patterns that we notice and these interpretations that we create, it tells us something about the society that we live in. We have created this knowledge. Before we consider this question about how do we know if this knowledge is accurate, let's clarify that there are different types of knowledge, and your textbook distinguishes four. There's traditional knowledge. This is the knowledge that your society, your culture kind of puts out there as just accepted truths, right? That, you know, we know this to be true in our society, that even if you yourself never experienced it firsthand, you feel like that this is true, this is factual or accurate because it is more or less accepted in society, in the society you live in, that it is true and accurate. The second type of knowledge is authority-derived knowledge. So there's some things that you know or think you know because people with authority told you that those things are true, and those people with authority and I want to emphasize here, these are people with authority that told you this was true, not because they know this themselves through scientific knowledge, but because they are themselves basing it on their experiential knowledge, right? So, your parents telling you something based on, their own experience. I know this to be true because of what I've experienced in my life. If you accept that truth, you are accepting it on the basis of their authority. This is also, of course, how religion works, right? You accept the teachings of your religious leaders. It perhaps may be based on their experiential knowledge. In most cases, it's usually based on they got it from an authority themselves, if the authority is even just kind of the written teachings and the written word of that religion. But that's both of those: parents, religion, authority-derived knowledge. The knowledge that best corresponds with our thought exercise is experiential knowledge. And this is the knowledge you gain through your own personal experience and observation. And this becomes a very common way of knowing things, of knowing something, especially once you reach adulthood. And then finally, there's scientific knowledge. This is the knowledge that comes from scientific study and research. So let's go back and consider that question that I asked. How do we know if what we've noticed, if our knowledge, if our conclusions are in fact accurate? Certainly with tradition and authority, and especially our own experiential knowledge, we can say that these conclusions may not be accurate, that they might be based on limited experience or exposure. No one is omnipresent and omniscient, especially experiential knowledge, because it is in fact shaped by our social location. It might be influenced by our values and our biases and our blind spots. And so all of this is just to say that when we think about all the ways in which we can know something, systematic research is the gold star standard. And systematic research is the way of knowing something that is most closely aligned with scientific knowledge, which is the superior form of knowledge. Because the other ways of knowing things, logical deduction, where you might take what you know about phenomena A and what you know about phenomena B, and those two things have a relationship with one another. And so you're like, okay, well, now I know about phenomena C, right? Even though you did not maybe directly witness or test or know anything about C, you're deducing it, right? Reliance on others, right? This way of knowing something is most closely aligned with the authority-derived knowledge. Personal experience observation, we already talked about this one. This is your experiential knowledge, which is oftentimes incomplete and subconsciously, just limited by our biases and blind spots. Mystical revelation, this way of knowing something has largely fallen out of favor for the most part in our society. We do not really establish it as being acceptable that you know something because God told you, or voices told you, or you got the answer from the spirit world. But it's worth noting that this way of knowing something does exist traditionally in a lot of religions, both Western and non-Western religions. So why is systematic research the much better way of knowing something when compared to these other ones? Well, off the top of my head, but obviously not off the top of my head because I took the time to type them and add an animation. Here are just 3 reasons why this is the gold star standard way of knowing something and why scientific knowledge is the superior form of knowledge. First of all, it helps control for personal biases. We'll at the end of this video, we're going to discuss bias in more detail, and is it ever really possible, to be bias free? But certainly by engaging in systematic research where you have this very structured process for testing and eliminating theories and collecting and analyzing data, it is meant to control for personal biases. because you have this structured process of collecting and analyzing data, it pushes you beyond your personal experience and casual observation, which is always going to be limited because, as I already stated, you are not omniscient and omnipresent. And then finally, because you are supposed to follow the systematic steps, but then also you disseminate your information, and you're required to be very transparent about, you know, your data collection, data analysis process, it allows us to check up on each other. And through doing so, we are able to disprove theories, to complicate theories, to create new paradigms, engage in paradigm shifts. And all of those terms will be a lot more clear in the next couple of slides. And systematic research accomplishes all of this, as I've stated, because it is the systematic way in which we collect and analyze empirical evidence, that we gather data and then analyze and disseminate it. And we'll talk about that more later on in the lecture when we go over the research model. Before we get into those theories of knowledge, Popper and Kuhn, let's also just briefly touch on the fact that your book makes a very, tries to make a very strong argument about why you should learn how to conduct research. And I'll be honest and transparent that I certainly think some of these reasons are more compelling than others. Like for the first one, that it can be fun when in charge of your own work and study. Like I said, to be transparent, I am not a methods person. I like to read about the scientific knowledge that other people have gathered in regards to topics I'm interested in. I have never been very motivated to do my own research, which was definitely a bit of a problem in my PhD program. But I know people who feel this way. I had people in my graduate program who felt this way, and I have people, current faculty colleagues now, who really do enjoy and probably would even use the word fun. But what about number two? Even if you don't find it fun, you might find it professionally useful. I sometimes get students who ask, what am I going to do with a sociology major? And for a lot of students, they go into some form of social services or nonprofit work. And I do think sociology does set you up well for that. However, if you are the type of person that you find yourself more interested in these methods classes and your, especially when you get into your quantitative, qualitative, upper level methods classes where you learn a lot more about how to engage in the process of collecting and analyzing data. If you really enjoy that, there are jobs that highly prize data collection skills. The government, businesses that conduct market research, and even nonprofits that engage in their own research. And for people that are motivated by money, oftentimes if you go this methods approach, more so than social services or education, you might be able to kind of carve yourself out a quite lucrative path. For me, number three is the strongest, especially if you go beyond what the book said, which says understanding research will make you an educated consumer. And I added the words and citizen. People will definitely use people's lack of knowledge and understanding around research and statistics to influence them. Because if you don't understand data collection, you don't really understand statistics, it leads you to just trust people when they shoot out numbers. And you don't necessarily say, or you don't necessarily analyze, did these numbers come from a good research study? What type of methods did they use? How big was the sample? Was that a sufficient sample? Is there missing data? All of these are things that hopefully you will learn how to do in this class. And I feel like being a more educated consumer, but particularly being a more educated citizen, will allow you to participate more fully in society and hopefully make informed decisions about not just what products you buy, but what politicians you support, what policies you support, and so forth. So now, going back, or not going back, but introducing our two theorists from this chapter, beginning with Karl Popper. And this is pretty straightforward. And you might have even read it and been like, no duh. But it is the idea that it is by proving things wrong that we have advanced scientific knowledge. if we ask questions just trying to look for phenomena that already supports our accepted truths, our accepted theories, we might overlook the phenomena that complicates and refutes those theories. But it's only by trying to explain that phenomena, the phenomena that exist outside of your accepted theory, that science can be advanced. And he calls this process falsifying, right? By falsifying known theories, we create new knowledge. And you see there that cool little equation, which basically just kind of breaks down like this. You start off with a problem situation, right? Some question you want to answer that you want to understand. And you turn to, the theories that already exist, that are out there. And so you turn to those theories, and what that TT stands for is tentative theories, and you begin to test them to see which ones explain your phenomena best. And as you test them, the ones that don't explain your phenomena, you eliminate. And so if you falsify any of those tentative theories, you do this by what he calls the error of elimination. The theories that are eliminated are the ones that are falsified, and this process eventually leads to a new PS2, which is just a new problem situation, a more complicated, fuller question or understanding of social phenomena. And your textbook gives that really nice example of like trying to understand coffee. Why does, you accepted it as just a truth that drinking coffee too late in the day would keep you awake, but then comes the day where you're super tired, but you need to stay up to do something like, I don't know, study for your intro to research methods test. And then it doesn't seem to matter how much coffee you drink, you find yourself still unable to stave off being tired, which falsifies your theory that drinking coffee late at night will automatically keep you up. And it leads you to a new question, a new understanding of the relationship between drinking coffee and staying awake. The second theorist from this chapter is Thomas Kuhn, and his theory, the structure of scientific revolution, is as follows. He defines knowledge as a summary of general truths and laws about the world that are scientifically proven. And actually, you know what, as I go over this, I'm going to go to this slide, which is just a cool little graphic. So he's like, okay, we have these accepted truths that explain the world in what he calls paradigms. We have established paradigms, and science that more or less just looks to support these current paradigms is called normal science. Normal science is safe, and it's not focused on necessarily falsifying the current paradigms. It accepts them as being capital T truth. But at some point, maybe you notice that there are anomalies that exist that can't be explained by normal science. If the number of anomalies that can't be explained, if they increase to some type of critical mass number, you go into a period of crisis, because your paradigm no longer works. This capital T truth that you accepted is turning out to be not very true after all. And this leads to a period of what he calls revolutionary science, or revolution, right? So scientists have to now start trying to understand this phenomena without an established or accepted paradigms. And so as they go through the process of now doing what Popper would call falsifying established paradigms, eventually they will land on a new paradigm, thus, reflecting a paradigm shift. And as that new paradigm becomes more established as status quo, we are now in a new period of normal science that will continue until once again we reach this kind of critical tipping tipping point of anomalies that are now not explained by the new paradigm. And he did see this as being an ongoing a cycle, and that it was the point of science to engage in revolutionary science when necessary in order to advance scientific knowledge. Now, if either of my explanations of Popper or Kuhn left something to be desired, and I know that the book, doesn't spend a lot of pages on either one as well, you're welcome to check out these two videos that I found. The Popper one is very short. It just explains falsification, and it links it to another popular figure in the world of sociology, particularly sociological theory, Karl Marx. The Kuhn one's a little longer because it gives you more background about his life, which obviously I'm not going to hold you responsible for, but it does offer a very nice explanation of the structure of scientific revolutions. So like I said, if my explanation didn't help and the textbook explanation still isn't very clear to you, I strongly encourage you to check out those videos. But it brings me to kind of the next focus in this chapter, which is whether you're talking about falsifying theories or whether you're talking about engaging in revolutionary science and shifting paradigms, what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? What is this process by which we, obtain scientific knowledge? And it brings me to something that should look very familiar to you, which is the research model, also referred to as the scientific method. And this is the structured process by which we collect, analyze, and disseminate empirical data or empirical knowledge. And it's 8 steps. Okay, sorry, I had to pause there. My dog was being loud, but I think I stopped around, I was saying it's 8 steps. Select a topic, define the problem, review the literature, formulate a hypothesis, choose a research method, collect the data, analyze the results, share the results. And because, as both Kuhn and Popper emphasize, that this is an ongoing process, when you share your results, it stimulates more ideas for research. It encourages people, if they're kind of in the thinking of Popper, to falsify, the theories or to shift the paradigms in which you use. But it encourages other people to replicate our process, which brings us back to step 1, right? Now, what I do want to emphasize here, and as you can kind of see in my little list there, is that step number 4, formulate a testable hypothesis, I have a bunch of asterisks beside. And that's because depending on the type of research that you're engaging in, you may not always do this step. And that's fine. That doesn't mean that you are not engaging in scientific research. And that's because in the social sciences, we do not always engage in what is called deductive research. Deductive research is the type of research that is most closely aligned with that 8-step research model, where you begin with ideas, and those ideas are largely gleaned from what is already known from others who have engaged in this process. And then you form hypotheses based on what is already known. And then you go out, collect your own data, test those hypotheses, and then publish your results. And so that is how deductive research works. But there is this other form of research where instead of beginning with ideas, you kind of actually begin with gathering the data. And then once you see what's in your data, you then develop your ideas. And we call this inductive research, that you go out in the field with a question or an interest or whatever topic. But instead of beginning by, looking at what other people have done and formulating a hypothesis, you collect your data, you analyze it, interpret it, you relate it to prior research, which might lead you to formulate new ideas, some of which even sometimes require you to go back to collect even more data. And you might repeat that part of the cycle several times before finally you get your ideas to the point where you're like, okay, I have now gleaned some new scientific knowledge that I am now ready to share. So we call that inductive research. And in that form of research, there is no hypothesis. These two different types of research are also kind of usually more likely to be related to one form of collecting data than another. And I probably said that horribly, but basically what I'm trying to say here is that oftentimes deductive research is more commonly based on what we call quantitative research, while inductive research is more often associated with qualitative research. And what is quantitative versus qualitative research? Quantitative research is data that can be quantified, that can be turned into numbers. And this is particularly your surveys and experiments where your results can be turned into quantifiable, entities that can be statistically analyzed using statistical programs like SPSS or SAS or Stata. And oftentimes, because the data can be quantified, quantitative research is associated with large-scale surveys, right, that ask a lot of questions, large sample sizes, because, and we'll talk about this more in subsequent chapters, in order for it to be quantifiable, it means it is a fairly straightforward, close-ended question, right, where you give people options A, B, C, or D. Then we can change those into numbers. So we can ask that of a lot of people because once you learn how to use statistical software, even if you are analyzing the data of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, people, or, census data, of course, which is, millions of people, it's actually pretty straightforward. And so as the slide here notes, it does offer insight into the social behaviors and social attitudes of large populations, right? So qualitative data, however, is data that cannot be quantified. This is data that you gather and it comes back to you in the form of text, of words, right? And so the type of methods associated with qualitative research are things like focus groups, participant, non-participant observations, interviews, particularly open-ended, interviews, qualitative interviews. Not only because these methods tend to be more time intensive, but also because the analysis of your data here, of textual data versus quantitative data, is also more time consuming, even though there are computer programs to assist you with that. This tends to be much smaller sample sizes. And the yield, what you get is more in-depth knowledge. So you won't know, your sample won't be as large, right? So you won't necessarily be able to say like, oh, I know a lot of people feel this way, but you'll be able to answer the why questions, right? But I know why this much smaller number of people feel this way. And so the example that I give here, right, if you want to know the percentage of US parents who use corporal punishment, spanking, right? That's a pretty straightforward quantitative research question that you can ask, right? Because it's a number. But if you want to know why parents in particular demographic groups are more or less likely to use spanking as a disciplinary method, because now you're getting into why, and you're trying to figure out motivations and what is impacting their likelihood to use this method more than that method, that is the type of question that is probably better answered by a qualitative interview. So you're going to get more detailed data, but from less people, versus the other one, which gives you less detailed data, but from a lot more people. And there are, of course, benefits of using both. And then the third methodology that your book talks about, mixed methods, it kind of combines the best features of both, right? Where you are using some combination of quantitative and qualitative methodologies and kind of going back and forth between the two. And that's just a cute little cartoon that I found that kind of just highlights that there are strengths and benefits to using all three, in my opinion. It really just depends on your focus and your question. And so this brings me to kind of the final little component of this chapter, which is where they're talking about ethics and values and what role do they play in research. So your book focuses on ethics, and then I just want to add some discussion around values. So, what are ethics? Ethics are kind of the morals, the values that govern our behaviors and decisions. It's our, what we ought to do's. And so because it is the what we ought to do's, in research, we do have what's commonly called a code of ethics, or what your book refers to as ethical rules. And this is when we are engaging in research, these things is what is expected of us. And it's meant to protect the larger public. It's meant to increase transparency. It's meant to protect your participants. And so some of those ethical rules that your book discusses include informed consent, making sure people know what they're participating in as much as possible, protecting subjects' privacy, confidentiality. Sometimes students get confused and they're like, oh, but if the researcher knows I'm participating, that's not confidential. It's like, no. Confidentiality isn't the same thing as anonymity, right? We aren't promising that you'll be anonymous, particularly to the researcher who is studying it, right? There's really no way to do a qualitative interview or a participant observation and not know, the person that who is participating, but you are perhaps protecting them when you are writing up your results and when you disseminate them from other people knowing their identity. And so that's confidentiality. We want to protect subjects from harm, and this can be both physical harm as well as mental harm. And we also need to protect subjects from coercion, right? People need to be able to freely enter into participating in your study. That's a key part of informed consent. And so that's why it's always just a little dicey when, professors rely on their own students to participate in their research, because even if they don't mean to be coercive, it might feel coercive, right? If your professor's like, hey, I'm doing this research project, I would like for all of you to participate, but you can say no. Even if they're saying you can say no, in the back of your head, you're like, okay, if I'm one of the only people that say no, is my professor going to resent me? Is this going to impact my grade in some way? And so you want to make sure that type of coercion isn't occurring. Similarly, that's why a lot of research tries to avoid using as subjects, people that are incapacitated in some way, prisoners, people in facilities, because once again, are they really able to freely give their consent? And that's a concern. And then just kind of taking a step back and not really focusing on even necessarily what the ethical rules that pertain to our participants, but just in terms of when we put information out there, when we disseminate the scientific knowledge that people who don't engage in systematic research are counting on us to disseminate, we want to be very honest and transparent about conflicts of interest, right? Because if your research is being funded by a company or is being funded by a particular politician or a group, even if you have taken the steps to make sure that you are not biased, you want to make sure people are at least aware of that relationship to that group, that politician, that company, so that there isn't even the suspicion or perception of bias. And so for a lot of researchers, especially in like the last, 70, 80 years, there's really been a crackdown on trying to prevent researchers from engaging in unethical research. And this is after World War II, post World War II era. And so in colleges, we have IRBs, institutional review boards, and they are meant to kind of make sure that your proposed research is not breaking any of these ethical rules. Because when you do, it can be disastrous, and the consequences can be devastating, not just to the participants, but to entire communities. And a good example of that is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which your book goes over, and I give you a very short clip there, about 2 minutes. But this is a experiment where the progression of syphilis was studied, although sometimes commonly people think that people were infected with syphilis, and that's not true. But people were put in a study that had syphilis. But then at some point, when medicines and vaccines came out that could have helped them in and or prevented the spread of the disease to their romantic, intimate partners and their children, the vaccines were withheld from them, along with additional lies that they were given about what was truly going on. And the video notes and your book notes, this has led to a certain amount of distrust of the medical community, particularly among African Americans, that has had pretty serious consequences till today, almost 100 years later. And so this is part of why ethics is so important. Now, you've heard me use the word bias several times, and so this is kind of my final slide about going over the material from chapter 1. The goal is to approach your question, your topic, with objectivity, right? The ability to perceive and represent the object of the study accurately without personal preference or judgment, as compared to subjective thinking, right? Where you let your own judgments kind of cloud how you shape your study, and how you engage in your study, and how you perhaps even interpret and disseminate your information. Now, I'm introducing the concept values and some of these new terms because I think sometimes students conflate the use of values and bias. So let's talk about values first, right? So values are, as it suggests, things that you hold in esteem, things that you put in a pedestal, right? Things that you value, as right there in the term. People's values are oftentimes parts of their research. Researchers would not dedicate the time, energy, effort that it takes to engage in research, particularly large-scale research projects, if it wasn't a topic that they cared about, if it did not in some way probably correspond with their values. People who do climate change research, it probably has a lot to do with the value that they place on the environment, or us having a sustainable future, and that's okay. For the most part, most people consider it is impossible to have value-free research because your values are going to shape what you choose to research and what you don't choose to research. Like, it's right there in step 1. Now, what you should, seek to obtain is not necessarily value-free research, but value-neutral research, where your values might shape the questions that you ask. But once you start the process of planning your research, establishing your sample, gathering your data, analyzing your data, you want to be value-neutral. You want to make sure that you are not, to go back to our definition of objectivity, that you aren't allowing your personal preferences or your judgments to color how you are perceiving and understanding and interpreting the data. right? Just because you want something to be true, you need to make sure that you are not trying to systematically set up your research in a way to assure that answer that you seek. Because once you start systematically trying to get an answer, you are now engaging in bias. And a bias is when you have your results, or when you have your research be systematically misrepresenting the full dimensions of what's being studied, right? So bias is in a methods definition, means that you have done something to systematically try to shape your answer. It could be related to your samples, right? Right, and your book talks about selective observation, where you make very pointed choices about what to include versus what not to include, because you're trying to, once again, guarantee a certain answer, to guarantee a certain observation. It could, another form of systematic bias that can exist in methods, is overgeneralization, right? When you, in your analysis and then in your dissemination, right, when you overstate the extent to which a phenomena exists, and you purposefully do that, right? And so you want to accept the fact that your values might influence your question, but they don't need to influence how you then go about sampling and collecting and analyzing your data. If your values are doing that in a systematic fashion, your data is now biased. And instead of this being good, gold star scientific knowledge, this becomes very problematic knowledge. Now, the good news is because we emphasize replication, because we emphasize falsifiability, because we emphasize transparency, another scientist will probably come along and replicate your study as a way of revealing the truth, right? Revealing the true answer when stripped of those biases in the methodology. But this is all just very confusing to, the average Joe, Jane, consumer, reader, citizen, right, who will then have this competing claim out there. And this is why this, once again, goes back to my point about why I think it's useful for you all to study research methods, is because when this happens, when someone does maybe put out data that then winds up being falsified or accused of being biased, you have the ability yourself to go into the study and figure out, okay, what is happening here? Because everyone that refers to something as biased, on the internet, does not know the true meaning of that term. But hopefully, as we now reach the end of this video, the end of this chapter, you all are beginning to understand that this has a real meaning in the world of methods, and what it looks like and why it should be avoided. And so that is it for chapter 1. You do have an assignment, a discussion question due on the 4th, and at 11:59 p.m. But otherwise, I will be back with you when I do the video for chapter 2.